Okay, so welcome. Welcome back to those of you who were here yesterday, and welcome for the first time for those of you who are just joining us for the one day. It's nice to see a cluster of people all sitting together. When you all spread out, it's much more difficult to talk to you, so it's nice that you're all over there. Although you're probably going to get a crick in your neck because the screen's on the opposite half of the room from you. We have 22 speakers over the course of these 2 days talking about their multidisciplinary talks for you, and Andrew and I are going to spend the first session talking about why we're doing all of that. But I wanted to start off by saying that as well as for the people who are here talking, we want to make this as useful for everybody in the room as possible. And so our job is at the university is to talk to students and teach them about the things the university expects you to become good at, but which your subject lecturers maybe don't spend a huge amount of time talking about because they teach you the subject that you're studying. And so some of you, if you're in your later years, might know Andrew and I from classes on dissertations or critical analysis, or if you're in first year, actually, you'll probably have seen us for other different things as well. So that's the type of thing I mean, extra stuff that's not the subject. And part of that is communicating your stuff to an audience. So here we have this. But to make sure that you get something from it, between each presentation, we're going to have a slide up on the screen which basically says that you can send feedback to the presenter. And this is the slide that you'll see. Oops, that's the wrong button. The questions are, what was your take-home message? The second question is, what would you like to have heard more of? So what did you get? What would you like to hear more of? And then the third one is maybe the most interesting one for you as an audience member to make sure that you get something, because we want you to think about what these people that you're going to see have done to make their story as easy for you to understand as possible. So if they did something interesting on the slides that you've never seen before, or you have seen but you still think it's really good, tell them that. And maybe it's not about their slides, maybe it's about the way that they conduct themselves while they're standing up here. Tell them that. And then by thinking about that, hopefully you'll go off and maybe your next presentation or your next piece of writing or whatever will be all the better for it. All right. So I'll pull this back up and I'll walk you through how to get into that system at the time. But for now, I'm going to switch over to, sorry, it's not in PowerPoint, it's in Prezi. It's here, and Andrew's going to take over.
Yeah, just as another thing, so the way the day will work is the same as it worked yesterday for the folks that were here. So we have tea and coffee just now. We will go through a couple of sessions, and then we've got lunch again, and then we will have tea and coffee again in the afternoon. Right, so on that point, the toilets are just along that way. Okay, so that's the way the day will work. So what Scott and I wanted to do was kind of use this as an opportunity to talk a wee bit about what we do and our research a wee tiny bit, and then talk about why we think that things like Talk About X and exposition matter so much, and why we spend our time thinking about, writing about, talking about X and talking about the stuff that you guys do. So our department is weird in the university in that we are a very, very multidisciplinary department by nature. So I'm a political historian, Scott's a geneticist, we have English literature people, we have mathematicians, we have a whole scope of basically every subject background that you can imagine, all stuck working together in the same department. And so part of that is then that we have to communicate why we do things and how we do things and the ways in which we do things to each other in a way that makes sense. And so from that was born the idea of something along the lines of Talk About X, where we get you guys to communicate your research to a broader, wider audience. So what we're going to do and start with is I'm going to talk a little bit about some of my research, and then Scott's going to talk a little bit about some of his research, and then we'll talk about the communication of that. All right. So what I want you to do first is start to think about every word in the English language, and start to think about that not just as in every word that we currently have in the English language, but every word that we have ever had in the English language since English was born as a language. So if we do that, then we see that we have about 800,000 words available in the history of English. So as speakers of English, we have had at any point 800,000 words, more or less, to pick from. So then imagine that in the 1960s, a group of eccentric Glasgow academics decided to try to catalogue and categorise every single one of these words into groups of meanings. What they did was sit down with every dictionary ever published, pretty much, and tear out each individual dictionary page and go through and catalogue and categorise every single word that we have ever had into what does it mean, how did we use it. So if we did that, then we see that we have in English about 225,000 different meanings. So over the entire history of English, we have had about 225,000 different concepts, different ideas that we can talk about. Right? And that goes from Old English, so from about 800-ish AD up to modern times. Okay. Within that then, we can see that there's, on average, 3.5 words per meaning, but the language doesn't work like that. So we have some very specific meanings that have very few words, and some very broad meanings, or some meanings that have lots of synonyms. So in English, we have a couple of different obsessions. Firstly, anybody who's stupid, or a blockhead, or dull, is one of our most popular categories. I think there's about 250 different words for somebody who is an idiot. Okay? So people who speak English basically like calling each other idiots, stupids. One of our other most popular categories is one that shifts its meaning over time, and the change here is that it starts off meaning immediately, so something that must happen right now, and that shifts over time to mean soon, soonish, later. Right? So when we develop more and have got more words, and as the meaning of those that now has got softer, we needed to create a new word to say, well, actually, no, I need it now, because what was now means tomorrow. So we have that kind of shift and change over time. So where I come into that then is to say that this categorization of every word in English was published as the Historical Thesaurus of English. So the project started in 1962-63. Sitting down with dictionaries takes a long time, so the final publication was in 2009. So it's just come through in the last couple of years, published here at Glasgow. And so where I come in then is, as a political historian, I look at the language of ideas and the language of concepts in politics. So I look at how we talk about things in politics and how politicians frame ideas, frame concepts. As a historian, I work in what's called the Cambridge School, or the Cambridge approach to history, and this is where we take an idea that in order to fully understand how somebody and why somebody did something in the past, we have to understand the ideas that they are surrounded by, right? So that intellectual world in which they live, and that changes and adapts over time. And the intellectual world in which we live is different from that in which somebody in 1950 or 1900 or 1750 or whatever lived, right? So one of the leading thinkers in that Cambridge school is Quentin Skinner. He said that there are in fact no such timeless concepts, but only the various different concepts which have gone with various different societies. Right, so my approach, my methodology in effect, is to adopt that of this intellectual approach to the study of ideas and concepts and apply that specifically to political language. So an example of this then is if we look at how speakers of English have talked about what it means to be uncivilized. So we take all the words that we have ever had in the English language to mean uncivilized, going from, at the top left, the oldest words in Old English, all the way down to the bottom right, through amazing words like mountainous and tramontane, and all the examples of the use of tramontane in the dictionary are amazing because it's this like so laboured, dandy-esque. Like, I'm sure if you find that this would happen, it is the most tramontane idea, and it literally means beyond the mountains. But it is a brilliant, brilliant word, and I love it. All the way through down to things like jungle, jungly, and pre-civilized by 1953. Right? So, as speakers of English, we have always had, or we have had throughout our history, 42 words to talk about what it means to be uncivilized. So what I did then was think about, well, how do we start to catalogue that, and how do we start to categorize that? And so from that we can see that, or I think we can see that there are a couple of different what we call sense families. So approaches to our understanding of how speakers of English have catalogued and categorized incivility. Right? So this goes in rough chronological order, but it doesn't mean that one of these ideas dropped out of use. Right? So wild the way that we initially spoke about people who were uncivilized was to say they were animalistic. They were like animals, they were wild. That then expanded and adopted in the concept of being unfinished, unpolished, crude, rough. And then in the 14th, 15th, and 16th century, we started to adopt what was a formerly Greek word of barbar. And this is how Greeks described people who spoke non-Greek. So they would say that anybody speaking not Greek said bar, 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 bar. In English, we would say blah, 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 blah. Right? So from that, then we can say, okay, the speakers of non-Greek were barbarians. And that's where that word comes from. And then in the 15th, 16th, and 17th century, we had the development of the concept of the state. Right? So we created nation-state, or we started the process of creating nation-states. We started to build up the significance of the state. And so this became our dominant term, uncivilized, outside of the state, beyond the state. And then the newest one is the other. And this is as speakers of English came into contact with other people, different people. We explored the world, built the empire. We came into contact with others, different people who were different from us. And some of the words in that category are horrible to us now, that we would just never ever use now. But this othering process where you say, well, I am this, and you are different from me, so let's use a word to say the ways in which you're different. Right? So if we take that down a wee bit further and look at barbar as an example, then that at the top is the list of variations of barbarian, in effect. So barbarous, semi-barbarous, and so on. Initially, the way this began was that connotations of sound remained. Right, so the first quote there from Sydney Smith, when shall I see Scotland again? Never shall I forget the happy days I passed there amid odious smells, barbarous sounds and suppers, excellent hearts and most enlightened and cultivated understandings. Right, so we've got barbarous sounds, enlightened and cultivated understandings. That seems odd to both of us, right, to us now. Then, by the 20th century, you've got Americans are the only race which passed directly from barbarism to decadence without knowing civilization. Right, so that sound connotation has vanished. Right? It's just Americans are, and have become again, barbarians. Right. Then, again, using an example from the House of Lords, from Hansard, in 1995, we can now see that in dealing with Russia, we are dealing with a semi-barbarous state and a society that only knew a measure of democracy for a few years before the First World War. Right, so then we're saying, okay, Elena, who works with me and at the background, is giving me the worst daggers just now because she's Russian. You can see that here, maybe this concept of barbarian or what it means to be barbarous is shifting to, is that then something tied up with democracy? Right, so does it mean, are you a barbarian if you're not democratic? So this concept shifts and changes over time and adapts over time. Okay. So that's one example using just a couple of words. And I think it ties in with this from Toynbee, saying that civilization is a movement, not a condition. It is a voyage, not a harbour. Right, so we have this view that we change and this will continue to change over time. So if we expand that out to English in general, as I said, the history of English has about 800,000 words. That's actually continuing to expand. We hit over 1 million words a couple of years ago, and the 1 millionth word in the Oxford English Dictionary was Web 2.0. This is the view of modern day English, which has about 500,000 words. Right? So as speakers of English, we can pick from about 500,000 words, and it's arranged according to meaning and according to ideas. So the way this works is black is Old English, darker yellow is older, brighter yellow is new. Right? And you've got the three categories of, on the top, the left, the world, the social world, and the mental world. Right? So you can start to see how English is built up, how English looks as a language. So we've got physics and chemistry, where's the thing there, are new, right? Because they're bright yellow, so physics and chemistry is new. Travel is over there, and we've got new patches in travel. Physics and chemistry is new, faith, unsurprisingly, is old. Right? So we can start to see then that English has this patchwork effect. Right? And English is the only language in the world for which we can do this. No other language has this historical thesaurus. So we are unique as speakers of English to have this ability to pick apart our ideas and our concepts and look at the development of them over time. So that's what I do.
Thanks. And so as a segue from one to the other, think about what Andrew said at the start about how a bunch of eccentric academics in the 60s decided to rip up the dictionaries and start categorizing all of the words, and think about how mundane that job must have been. And then think about me, I'm a geneticist by original training, and so I did something equally as mundane, and I spent all of my days moving tiny volumes of colourless liquid from one tube into another with a pipette, and hoping that I would get some kind of positive result at the end when I do something that turns it into something that I can look at. Right? So Andrew put his mundane practicality into something that was quite interesting. While you're listening to us, pay attention to the way that we present what our mundane stuff comes out as at the other end. So I will say instead, we have a problem. The problem, as far as my interests and my research go, is that one aspect of it is that we're living on a planet where the number of people is increasing at a rate that has never increased at before. So what you can see there up until the modern day is a history of what we know the population has been, and then beyond that, from the UN, we've got three projections. A best case scenario in green, where we start to bring the numbers of people on the planet back down. A medium case in orange. And then the red line is where things will go if the rate continues as it is today. And so by 2100, we'll be up way over 15 billion, which is more than double what we have, or about double what we have now. So we have a problem in that the world is being taxed in a way it's never been taxed before. We have another aspect to this problem, which is that we need to feed all of these people. And right now, we're kind of pushed for space already. In the space, we're not pushed for space because buildings are next to the farmland, but there's only so much space on the planet that's suitable for being farmed. So maybe we've got two problems to consider. Or maybe, to make things even worse, I'll throw in a third part to this mix. And this isn't unfamiliar to you, but the climate is changing. I'm not going to say that we have global warming. That's something that you all remember from the media when you were tiny. Nobody says global warming anymore. The phrase is climate change. So if someone says the planet's not getting hotter because we had a really cold winter, well, nobody said it was going to get hotter at every place at every point in time. It's changing. And so what you can see on the left is where we could grow rice in the 70s. Green is okay, red is not. And what is projected to turn out by 2050. And so you can see that there are huge swathes of land in North America, where rice is out of the question, huge swathes from Southeast Europe across to Asia, and in China, where you can grow rice right now, you won't be able to. And I choose rice because it's an example of a staple crop. So what's going on there? Poking towards my research. When plants get too hot, you might be familiar with the look of a wilted plant in your house. And they've run out of water. But more than that, what's actually happening that's dangerous to a plant, because you can water that and it'll recover. And I say plants here, thinking crops, obviously, from the image above. What's more dangerous is that if the temperature gets too high, the stuff inside the plant will cook, and there's no coming back from that. So my research then was to say, okay, if these are the problems, we've got more people, we need to feed them all, and actually the climate's making it more and more difficult to feed them, never mind the fact that there are more and more of them. What can we do about that? So, possible answers? Well, you've all fried an egg, or you've all seen someone frying an egg. What's happening when that happens is exactly the same as what's happening when the leaves of the crops are cooking, right? Proteins, which you can think of for the purposes of this talk as balls of wool, they're wrapped up in a very specific shape and they're all nice and compact. As the temperature goes up, they vibrate and the balls of wool start to unravel. When they unravel so much that they get tangled with each other, like when you go into your drawer and pull out your cables and they're all just a big mat, that is what's happening to the proteins in an egg white and why they become a solid mass. Inside every one of your cells is a bunch of proteins, and proteins are the most important thing inside of you, right? All of your bodily functions are carried out by proteins. There's a specific subset that look like this blue monster from an advert from about 20 years ago. It's a blob, and it's got two arms, and its job is just to hug stuff. So if you can think of the balls of wool, the proteins inside of you, as being represented by this nicely patterned green thing up here, right? That's a ball of wool in the shape that it should be. As the temperature goes up, it starts to unravel, and then I'm going to swap the blue hug monster for these pink things with two arms on them. This is how molecular biologists tend to represent proteins. The pink things say, oh, the temperature's going up, now it's time to go and hug the proteins that are in danger of falling apart, and they basically just grab them so they can't unravel themselves. And that's how you cope with high temperatures. And you end up not going into the fried egg situation, and you can live to grow another day. So my research said, what if we can take those blue hug monster proteins, the pink blobs on this diagram, and just turn them on all of the time? Will this make plants more tolerant of high temperatures? And so here are some of the plants I used in my experiments. This is a Petri dish. You're usually used to seeing this as a circular thing with bacteria on it. Here it is, it's square and it's got plants. It's like mind-blowing. And on the left-hand side, you've got normal plants that don't have any change in them, so we'll call this wild type. And on the right-hand side, some that have had the gene for the blue hug monster proteins turned on all of the time. And that's before we put them in the oven. Andrew says my PhD was in cooking because I put a lot of plants in a lot of ovens. And on the right-hand side, you can see what happened, 3 days after. And you can see from over here that, okay, maybe not every plant survived, and maybe they're looking a bit weak, but if you're a farmer, or you're a person who has to eat, that's the difference between having nothing to eat or nothing to make your living on and having something. So whenever I tell someone in 1 or 2 lines, or give them the elevator pitch for my PhD, I always make sure I finish up with the words, and if we can do this, we'll be one step closer to being able to feed the world. Because nobody's impressed by saying, I sat in a lab coat, or more often than not in my lab coat, moving tiny volumes of colourless liquid from tube to tube. If you've got to tell someone about something, you've got to make them understand why they should care.
So, because we're both up. So why we think that's important then is, as Scott said, he gets to boast to everybody that he is fixing global starvation. I get to play around with words and understand how words work. We have different interests and we have different reasons for why we like what we do and how we then can communicate that effectively or not. So one of the things that we are both very, very passionate about and interested in is this idea of a research conversation, of communicating our research, of engaging, of making our research engaging, right? So fundamentally, I am an 18th century British constitutional historian, right? That is not interesting. Okay, and I know that it's not interesting, and I know there's a switch inside my head that makes me say, actually, this really dry discussion of dead white men talking about constitutions actually is endlessly fascinating, and I will talk about it all day, but you don't want to hear that, right? Maybe except Lawrence, who does his PhD in a very similar topic. Most people don't want to know that. Scott, as he says, fundamentally, that's not really very interesting, no offense. You have to make it interesting, right? So this research conversation then becomes important, of saying, well, yeah, I do this, and how do I do this in a way that is can be communicated effectively? Okay. So that research conversation then becomes part of public engagement, and of having the public, in whatever manner that is, become engaged in the topic. Okay. So when we're thinking about that, then we think there are 3 main reasons for this, 3 main approaches to this. You have, firstly, either a personal or a national or a global significance as to why you look at your research. What does your research do? What does it say? What does it add? Right? So Scott, as I say, gets to say, cool, I'm fixing world hunger. I get to say, well, let's look at the way in which politicians frame ideas, have spoken about ideas, how we have got to where we are, and why we talk about things in politics in the way that we do. Or we have a duty, or we have a duty of public education. Right? So we sit in this beautiful, fantastic, amazing building, which is owned by the state. We have a duty to say, okay, let's give something back. Let's explain that to people. Let's get people engaged. Let's get people thinking about this. Let's get people enthralled by the things that we do in our amazingly beautiful ivory towers. Right? And then the third one, which is the one that we take most for Talk About X, is this multi-direction, multidisciplinary discussion. Right, so we had yesterday, Tom was talking about anthropomorphic algorithms, and he was saying that on one hand, he is a computing scientist, and he can do all the computing scientist stuff, but then he needs philosophers and geographers and sociologists and psychologists to say that, okay, cool, you can make, and the way that he phrased it I thought was great, so it's to say you can make this toy, but what does that toy actually do, and do we really want that to do that? So he's talking about his phone having regret. I really don't want to be judged by my phone. That is a horrendous state of affairs. So then we have this multi-direction, multi-discipline conversation happening. Right? And that benefits us, so we can see that in our department, when we have these conversations, when I sit down and bore Scott for an afternoon about saying, well, this is how 18th century constitutions work, let's go and let's talk about it. And I do, I get very excited. then that makes my research better, right? Because then I can talk about that and I can make that something that doesn't just excite me as a weird 18th century constitutional person, but vaguely interests Scott as a plant cooker. So,
so in doing Let's Talk About X for a few years, we've talked to the students who've gone through it afterwards, and we've asked them what they thought of it. And one person said, when I read through my presentation, it was so basic to me. I felt like I was literally just explaining everything, and it seemed so painfully obvious. And then when I was presenting, I was thinking, why am I even presenting this? It's not even worth explaining because it should be clear. And I think that's one of the challenges that anybody talking about their stuff to a non-specific audience has to deal with. Another one said, you're always with like-minded students and peers, and you think, everyone knows this. It's obvious. But it's not. So it's actually good to try to explain it also for myself in easier terms, because it's not always going to be an academic audience, you know? So why X? You will have heard the university talking at you about graduate attributes. This, although we didn't design it to fulfill graduate attributes, take that type of language and think about how it applies here as well. And we are continually, we've done it for 2 years in a row, we have continually been blown away by how it gives us a small insight into the enormous contribution to human knowledge that's generated by undergraduates doing research on courses that gets seen by their supervisor and the person who marks it, and then never again. Actually, same for our PhDs. And so here's a platform to share that, or to get you to thinking about how you might share it. Another person said, with love and knowledge, if you share it, it doesn't disappear. So I feel like I'm sharing the knowledge and then it doesn't disappear. I was like, I didn't know it and now I do, and I'm going to tell you about it because it's valuable and it's worth knowing. People in my year get surprised when I say I've done research. This was a first year or second year. The thing is, I don't think they really want to do research, so they're probably going to get normal jobs. And the other thing is, I think that they think it's too early to be doing research. If we have ideas, I don't think it's ever too early. And so the last thing, if you are in the audience and you've got another year at the university and you're thinking about maybe you want to get involved in this type of thing, Let's Talk About X will happen again next year, and you'll be paired up with a mentor if you put in an abstract and you're successfully chosen, because we only have so many spaces. It's unfortunate, but we do have to choose people. And so if you're a mentor, like stick up your hand, because we have them in the room here. So the people who are waving at the back over there, and Lawrence is one down the front here as well, but he's also running Twitter, so he's got his hands on his phone. We pair them up with students from a completely opposite discipline. So we have an astrophysicist talking to a creative writing PhD student. So they can say, well, your talk is good, but I still don't understand that word. So you need to tailor it.
So then the other half of this is then exposition. So we have Let's Talk About X, which is yesterday and today, and then exposition, which is our written journal counterpart. This is open again to all undergraduates, and it works in a very similar way where you are paired up, in this case with two mentors, one from within your subject and one from out with your subject. So we had last year papers on the securitization of nuclear power and how we justify the use of nuclear power, and we had another paper on the ways in which the Canadian government could promote cycling in Toronto, and we had another paper on antibiotic resistance. We had that same approach of saying there is no theme, there is no topic, but the approach is how do you communicate this in an effective manner. Right? So this is just a plug to say exposition will be happening again, and if you want to get your research published in a peer-reviewed academic journal, which for undergraduates is almost unheard of, then this is a way to start to think about that. You will have emails from us telling you more about this, but I just wanted to kind of hammer home the point there. So, if that works. What we wanted to kind of do for this is highlight the importance of public engagement and research communication, and explain a little bit of what it is that we spend our lives talking about, thinking about, writing about, and get you guys to do the same thing, so that you have this idea of, well, how does this work? How do you communicate your research in an effective, engaging manner to an audience that doesn't know necessarily anything about your topic? And as Scott said, as we have been so this is the third year we've done this, as we have been in the last 2 years, that how much time and effort everybody puts into the presentations is amazing and fantastic. And the impact of this across the university is becoming increasingly known and appreciated by the very highest levels of folks here. And Scott and I go around the country and parade everything that you guys have done as a way of saying, look how fantastic we are at Glasgow, look at how amazing we are at Glasgow, look at the stuff that our undergraduates do, we are so much better than you. And we get to do that in the easiest way because it's us saying, well, we don't even need to do that, everybody else gets to do that. So as a way of saying thank you very much again for coming along, and we hope that you enjoy the rest of the afternoon. Okay, thanks guys.